So deconstructing, dear Lord, dear God, deconstruct that.
Hey, welcome to Beer Christianity. My name is Jonty.
I'm Laura.
I'm Malky.
And this evening we are going to be talking about deconstruction, about deconstructing your faith, about that journey that a lot of people have been taking and that maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. We've spoken to a bunch of people this week who haven't actually heard of that and needed to, have it explained. So we're going to have someone explain it. It's somebody who used to be on the podcast, but is no longer with us. I will remember you in the arms of the angels. And it's Drabs. So let's go straight into that.
Deconstruction for me is about asking the questions that you were previously led to believe were off limits. That could be led to believe by some form of authority figure, maybe a leader or a church or the authority of a community or even a perception of God's authority or biblical authority. And then deconstruction is the moment you say, you know what, I'm going to lean in anyway. I'm going to lean into these questions which are burning within me, lean into this curiosity that I have and ask the hard questions. And there's a great freedom, almost a liberation that comes from that. But there can be a whole bunch of other things too. Maybe fear, often guilt, sometimes even some form of excommunication as well. For me, I don't think there was a particular moment or a trigger for this. It was more something that transcended my whole faith journey. I think all Christians, as we look at scripture, we recognize both the God element and the humanity element, and that partnership between God and humanity that results in the Bible. And the liberal tradition has often emphasized the human element of that, and the conservative tradition emphasized God's element and takes perhaps a more literal view. And I suppose I've always had this low view of scripture, this emphasis on the humanity of it. And so much of my deconstruction has hung on this question of what is the Bible and how do we understand it, because it feels like the gateway through which all these other kind of questions that we wrestle with are answered. So that's been really the story of my own deconstruction. I'd say I've gained a whole lot. I've gained most of all a faith that I feel proud of and that which really aligns with my values and which I don't have to kind of hold my nose at to deal with certain parts of. It feels fully me and I feel fully at home and alive in my faith. But I've also lost things along the way and probably that's a sense of being at home within Christian communities. I'm still in a church and I've worked for Christian organizations for a long time, but my spirituality, I feel like a guest in those environments, rather than fully spiritually at home. And spiritual home it's just become much more nomadic and it's often a lonely place. But that's okay. That's for me has been a price worth paying for having a faith which I'm comfortable with and I feel at home in.
So that's Drabs.
Thank goodness we don't have to listen to that guy anymore.
I know. He fucking talks and talks and talks. Am I right? I don't know. Malky, did you find anything of value in that?
No, I'm just glad that I've replaced him, to be honest.
I think we all are.
Whoa, what's happening? Drabs is back in the house. I'm not going to let you disrespect me like that.
What is this persona that you...
Is that what you talk like when you do youth work? Who's that guy who used to call himself the big dog on Radio 1? What was his name?
Tim Westwood.
Tim Westwood. Are you Tim Westwood? Is that what
Didn't he get Me Too'd?
I think so. And primarily because of the way he talks. Hey,
it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me back. Hey. What did you really think of my little speech about deconstruction? Be honest.
That's what we thought. I have no further notes. Does anybody have? No, I thought that was really good. I like that very much. Also, welcome back. Before we even start with that, welcome back, Drabs.
Hi.
Thanks. It's good to be back. I've had a change in employment, which means that I'm less worried about career damage associated with being on this podcast.
Love to hear it.
Fair.
Yeah, no,
fair.
That is absolutely fair. And you suggested this topic actually for tonight, which is why it's really great to have you on the show.
That's awesome. I don't recall that. Laura and I went out drinking last week and drank quite a bit, but that's great. And I'm glad that it's stuck with her and that we're discussing it because it is an important topic and probably important to a lot of our listeners as well.
I spent a very rambly voice note to Malky and Jonty after that night, literally on the walk home, because I was like, I need to do it now because otherwise I won't do it. And I haven't dared listen to it.
It was good. And also, I when you suggested it, I was like, how the hell have we never covered this directly on this show? Like, in terms of our core audience, I imagine everyone is deconstructing in some way, or they're listening into this specifically so they can combat the deconstruction in their church. I think those are the two. That's our entire Venn diagram of this show's listeners, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a
interesting.
glaring omission, and I'm not going to lie. Do you feel like the content strategy has suffered in my absence?
That's a
Wow.
comms director speaking, a real one,
Balls.
a hired one.
Well, some deep lore going on here. Read between the lines. It's interesting though, because I think you had to explain what deconstruction was to a couple of people that we have featured on the podcast tonight, which I think is interesting. Obviously, it's like totally fine to not know what deconstruction is, but I think we kind of go into this with this assumption that, oh yeah, deconstruction, everyone's doing it. It's a big hot thing.
Yeah, that the whole church is talking about it, either as denouncing it or embracing it.
Yeah, but maybe not so.
Some people have just like grown up or go to now just like nice, chilled out liberal churches.
Yeah,
you know,
they don't even have to deconstruct. Lazy bastards. Malky, we were talking about this. You, Laura, and I were talking about like where we are in terms of deconstruction. You feel that you've really done some deconstruction. You want to talk a little bit about this? Oh, by the way, dear listener, we've got a whole bunch of Vox Pops coming up in this and another episode, and we'd love to hear from you as well about your deconstruction experiences and all that kind of stuff. So that's coming up in the show. But yeah, Malky, tell us about your. Do you consider yourself to have been deconstructing, to have deconstructed?
Yes. Like in the context of my journey, if that makes sense, yeah. So as I say, like it's just interesting to kind of reflect, because from another person's point of view, you might go, yeah, you sound perfectly Christian to me, or perfectly Orthodox to me. But to the old me, to the kind of Calvinist lad, then I would be a wild non-believer, basically. But yeah, so, I think a combination of things. I think, I was drawn to extremes. I was looking for something. I was looking to attach myself to, a wider label, an authority or something. So that's what kind of led me into a more kind of hardcore conservative Calvinist approach. Your John Pipers, your Mark Driscolls. So yeah, and then I think it was there were some big things, but also just life happening, maturing, I think, growing up, and like maturing relationships and friendships, and relationship with my wife, and having children, and understanding what love is, for want of a less cheesy approach. But I think, and then kind of.
Sorry.
I want you to show me.
I want to know.
Everybody.
And I think I mean, there's just lots of parts to it, but I think one fundamental part is that character of God, and the view that I previously had. God was pretty angry and jealous and vengeful and held me at arm's length. And I kind of only got in on a technicality because of Jesus. Just, so I think that kind of, manifesting itself in like embracing or shining a different spotlight on different parts of the Bible. Because I think now I'd have the attitude where I'm quite happy to trust myself and my own opinions and be like, yeah, I believe this. I think the Bible says that, but I think that's bollocks. Whereas in the past, it would have been very much the opposite of Bible over feelings. Who am I? I'm probably a sinner. I'm probably making it up.
And do you feel like you're a guest in church, or do you feel like you're part of it? Because I think what Ben said about the the feeling a guest in church is really interesting.
Yeah, certainly, like specific churches, absolutely. Specific churches that I used to attend. But I think there's something like me and my wife are on similar but different journeys. And I'm at a point where I kind of I don't like certain types of fundamentalist Christians have a monopoly on the term Christian. So at certain points, my wife will be like, I wouldn't call myself Christian. And I'd be like, I think you mean like an evangelical Christian, or I definitely don't believe X, Y, and Z. But I would think that there's actually lots of Christians, and historically, Orthodox Christians who would, Christians that believe penal substitution is the be all and end all. Like, I think that's pretty niche in church history,
Yeah,
for
definitely.
example.
I think that's the thing.
Nicholas.
Sorry. Fucking Ben, honestly.
Look, he's back, and we're all like,
we're super excited.
Slotting together.
I was just saying, I'd love to hear more about your wife's story, because my memory is that she came from, I don't want to say cult, but like on the cult to Orthodox spectrum, it was kind of leaning that way, and just how her journey's been. If you feel permission to speak a little bit about that, because deconstruction takes on a whole new meaning, I guess, in that context.
Yeah. Well, we could hear from her herself.
We could hear from her herself. Why don't we do that now? And then we'll hear a little bit more about whether Laura thinks she's deconstructed. And but before we do that, let's talk about what we're drinking. Laura, what you drinking?
I am drinking a cider called No Brainer. That I believe
that's a good one.
Becky bought me for my birthday.
It's a lovely cider.
I'm very much enjoying it. It's very nice. So thank you, Becky. She might be listening. Who knows?
Excellent. Melks, what you drinking?
Perlenbacher. Alcohol-free. Lidl's finest.
Nice. Drabs, what you on?
So I'm on the finest Kronenberg 1664. Which you may laugh at, but tonight is one of them nights where I'm going for quantity over quality.
I'm just laughing at the way you read out 1664 as if there's like many varieties.
And also, I'm laughing at the way you introduced yourself with that super street talk, and then you've got the Kronenberg. I'm like, yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's all checking out. It's seamless. I'm drinking J.C. Leroux Sauvignon Blanc. It's a kind of like South African champagne prosecco type thing. It's it's not expensive if you're spending in pounds. It's really rather nice, and I'm having a lovely time. I even made myself a little ice bucket, so I am officially a champagne socialist. It's a Pyrex bowl and some municipal water, so it'll be brackish with, I think, some tank water ice cubes. An unholy abomination, which is absolutely, I think, the right kind of thing to have while we're talking about all of this heresy. So with that in mind, let's hear from Nikki, who also happens to be Malky's wife.
Well, that's not her whole identity.
Deconstruction started for me without me knowing what on earth that was. And it's really like one of those things for me that when I started to understand and hear other people talk about deconstruction, I suddenly realised that is what had been happening to me for many years. And I can't really say what the trigger for deconstruction was for me, but I can tell you how it felt. I really was starting to feel that my experience of life and faith wasn't honest when I tried to align with everything that I felt I was supposed to feel and think. My actual real experience was very, very different. And I'd gone through some things in my life that were really calling for me to face truth. And although that wasn't necessarily in the sphere of faith, I realised that it ran to the core of who I was, that the core of who I was very much about believing the right thing, doing the right thing, having the correct response to everything and thinking the right thoughts. And actually that I was life demanded, and I think God or spirituality demanded something far braver of me than that. And I read a quote which was by Anne Lamott, which was, "The opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. Certainty is missing the point entirely. Faith includes noticing the mess, the emptiness and discomfort, and letting it be there until some light returns." And I have to be honest, I think my deconstruction journey has been very dark and very lonely, because I had to let go of being right, of being seen to be right, and just get honest about some of the things that have never sat right with me about my Christian faith. It meant letting down people that wanted me to toe a certain line and believe a certain thing. But most of all, it meant letting go of my own safety and security and certainty and sitting in the darkness for a while. And I'd love to say that all the light has flooded in and returned, but actually I think my tolerance for the dark and my tolerance for the unknown has grown, and I've become more comfortable with it. And I have far less answers. I wouldn't probably consider myself to be Christian now, if I'm really honest. But even that has taken many years to say. There's a lot of fear involved in that for me. But whatever I do feel and experience now is far more loving, far more kind. There's so much more potential that I see in connecting with this world, connecting with people, and connecting with myself. And the God that I feel at the core is very much the same, but the box that God came in has been bust open. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's been my deconstruction journey.
It's so interesting because, like you say, like I think an atheist who heard that would be like, yeah, no, there's no different. These two pictures are the same. Like this is just a Christian, you know. And yet, I don't know. I don't know if it's okay to say that it's almost sad that somebody would say that they wanted to let go of that identity. Maybe it's not sad. I don't know. But just feeling so different for us when we deconstruct, or when we change from being fundamentalists or being evangelicals. Just,
I think it is a bit sad. I think it's okay to say that's sad because, I mean, Ben, you spoke a bit about this of like, I think so much of the themes of what we've heard, we've received a number of voice notes from people, and so many people have spoken about how this is quite a lonely journey, and this is something you lose is that identity in a church family, in a community. And I think that often is because people are finding themselves in church situations that they aren't agreeing with and finding pushback or difficulty to move away with that and change their faith. And that is naturally going to be a very lonely experience. That's sad that somebody has to experience that, even if it is to find a faith that is better for them.
and obviously there's going to be, you know, people who are listening to this who are not on board the whole deconstruction train, who would say, whatever happened to truth, whatever happened to, you know, not just believing what you want to be true. But I think what Nikki says there is just really important. Of the God that she felt, her experience was not like tallying with the theory she was hearing. And in a lot of these fundamentalist and evangelical churches, I remember being told, oh, but it's about your relationship with God. It's not about the church. It's not about the pastor. So for me, I think this journey was a lot easier, partly because I was a convert, but partly because I believed that. So I was like, oh, well, you know, since since that's the case, I guess it doesn't really matter if other people, don't agree with my take on this because it's between me and God. I don't know, Laura, has that been your experience? Because when we started talking about this, you were like, oh, I don't think I've started deconstructing, or I've needed to. And then, you watched a Dan McClellan video and listened to his podcast, and now you're fully deconstructed.
Yeah, no, I've really gone through that whole process in about an hour. I think that's all it took me. And yeah, I know this kind of started from, I think I have not had to deconstruct in the same way that I think you at least you three, I think, have had to deconstruct, or have, I don't had to, but have deconstructed. I think part of it is because I'm a woman. I think, I think there is, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly true for all of your experiences, but I think a lot of young men who grow up in evangelical circles end up, going down the path of the Mark Driscolls and all that jazz. And that is not necessarily something that tends to be more appealing to young men for that reason. So I think for a lot of, I feel like this is something that obviously I probably would still have done, but I think being a woman has a different aspect to it. But also just, I think, because of the way that my faith formed and is still forming, I think I have not come from the experience of growing up in an environment that I have fundamentally disagreed with, or had, I don't know, I felt a pressure to believe a specific thing, partly because I was not strong in my faith. I think kind of listening to these voice notes has actually been super helpful to realize where I may have deconstructed without realizing it, or want to deconstruct in the future. But I think I've kind of realized I did hold my faith in faith in kind of my culture and identity in almost two separate hands. I didn't feel the need to merge them until I've kind of matured a bit and realized, no, I do need to kind of grapple with some of the things that I may not be consistent with my beliefs and my faith, and kind of dealing with that. And so I think maybe I haven't needed to deconstruct in the same way that a lot of people have, but I do think I maybe need to do a bit of that. I think it's less about, I think we have come to view deconstruction in that kind of typical, well, I've grown up in this particular environment that I haven't agreed with necessarily, and now I'm coming to think with now I'm coming to realize that I don't have to believe all those things and I can do something different. I think the reason that I started this conversation, I was like, well, we're now having a generation of people who are growing up who are the children of those people who now don't have to deconstruct in that way because they're not being brought up in that way. I think those people now are still going to have to deconstruct in some way. It will just be different. And I think it's naming the process of deconstruction as just simply grappling with the ideas that you have been given and understanding them, not necessarily coming to the conclusion that those ideas were wrong, but just dealing with them properly.
Yeah, in some ways, it's just healthy religion, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's what I was implying by the context. Like, robust discussion was always encouraged, when in my younger years. But like, when I reflect back, it's always within actual pretty strict parameters. Like, you might have, even that got pretty hairy at times. Like, I was going to, use a baptism example, like infant baptism or believer's baptism. But like, I actually remember discussions where that's a fucking salvation issue, guys. Like, if you don't. So I think, being in the context where the parameters are very small, and if you step outside, if you kind of have a different role on whatever gender roles or whatever, then you're not really a Christian, Yeah, whereas growing up in an environment where there's broader discussion and people are less uptight about that, then I think, deconstruction is quite a harsh concept.
Or even that they're just not going to force you to commit to believing, or commit to something. Yeah, that you're not.
It's not an all or nothing deal.
Yeah.
Am I the only one though who finds? I don't want to
actually.
I don't want to be. Yeah, I don't want to be the actually guy. I don't want to be that guy because because I think I hold a lot of these beliefs, but I find the term slightly irritating in the kind of like,
Deconstruction.
yeah, must we
Yeah, I mean, I've used it a
the
lot in
process
my
of just being a reasonable human being? Like,
yeah, because I feel like we've maybe I think maybe the term has evolved to kind of mean just simple questioning of your faith, and that is literally what you just said. Like, it's just good religion, isn't it? And I think I think we're in a place in our culture now where it feels like any sort of like questioning of kind of what we're told of us is faith is suddenly like, well, like that's deconstructing, when maybe it's not. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but certainly I felt like American evangelical circles, it feels like that would be the case of like anything you're being given to question a pastor's opinion would be seen as like whoa, that's a big.
and I think in our circles in England, where you're mixing with progressives and with intellectual Christians, it seems ubiquitous. But talking to somebody in South Africa, where I'm sitting currently, and I was speaking to her recently about this subject, and she said, "Oh, I don't know anyone like that. Never heard of the subject. Never. I don't know anybody who's doing that. I don't know. The only Christians I know are conservative, evangelical, the people who would be hostile to any of these questions," which I think is, yeah. And in terms of context, I think it's probably worth hearing from somebody who is not deconstructing, but who understands the context and why maybe it felt quite necessary, particularly in Britain, in a kind of previous generation. So we're going to play you something from Martin.
Hey there, this is Martin Saunders. I am the founder and director, I guess, of the Satellites event, which is a summer event for Christian young people, just like the ones I used to go to when I was a teenager. And I don't think I am deconstructing, but I know that a lot of people from my era are doing that. I was raised in sort of 1990s evangelical Christianity in the UK, which I think is one of the flavours of kind of Christian faith that's now seen as most problematic. And I think some of the hallmarks of that were a sort of real focus on personal holiness, personal purity, and the idea of sin being about things I do really that sort of that upset God because they break his moral code. And so that meant, no violent movies, no sweary songs, absolute sexual purity, which of course all that did really was drive some of those behaviours underground and create lots and lots of shame, which maybe now bubbles up years later as the need to step away from, tear down, deconstruct what we experienced in that time. I totally understand it. I totally sympathise it. I totally sympathise with it. I think it may be what I've done instead of deconstructing. Maybe this is deconstructing, is kind of separate out the good stuff from the bad, but hold on to the good and hold on to the fact that, our youth leaders in the 90s, were doing their best, but they were very much of a time and of a culture. And so partly, I think because I understand the motivations and how we got there and maybe how we've moved on to what, or how I've moved on to a more progressive kind of position and way of thinking about things like sin, for example, has helped me to sort of stay the course in Christian faith without feeling like I need to start saying, gosh, I don't know what I'm rooted anymore. Like, I still feel profoundly rooted in Jesus, because I guess one of the good things that my 90s youth group faith instilled in me was focusing on Jesus as the center of our faith and the way that he's revealed through the Gospels particularly. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you put a modern lens on it and you grow up a little bit and you realize that maybe sin wasn't about the individual things we did that broke the particular code that God has for us, but rather it's about our participation in the systems that just like make the world a worse place. And And that's the antithesis of what the kingdom is trying to do. What's interesting is when I talk to young people now, because that's kind of what I do for a living, when I talk to young people now, they really seem to respond to that view of sin. You know, that idea that it's about all of us being responsible for getting the world into this place and this mess that we're in. And actually our need for repentance, our need to turn away from that, to think differently, to say sorry for our part in it. That makes a lot of sense. And so that's the faith I've grown into and the one that I hope to pass on to others. But somehow, maybe through holding on to Jesus, I've managed to hold it together.
Ben, you talk to young people for a living. What do you think?
I talk to some different young people to Martin because they are not convinced that sin is... I don't even know where to start with this. Goodness me. Also, watching movies with swearing or something as another things that Martin... I think we probably have a different understanding of deconstruction because like my thing, like for example, at the moment is like, I'm not sure I believe in an empty tomb, but can I still hold on to an Orthodox Christian faith with that? And I think I can.
Yeah.
But that's a different ballpark to maybe can I watch violent or scary movies and still be a Christian? So,
but maybe the point is that it was that ridiculous that things as obviously fucking insane as you can't watch violent movies or listen to sweary songs, things as obviously stupid as that were ubiquitously accepted in the culture. Because I definitely remember that in my church, in many churches that I was a part of. And like the number of people I know in evangelical circles who had real problems with these things and really needed to struggle with them and wrestle with them so that they could listen to fucking Eminem. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not even good music, just sweary music.
Hey.
Yeah, I knew Milky would jump in with that.
But also, Jonty, I just wanted to jump in there. I'm sure it was not long ago we were talking about someone, in passing. Was it some celebrity or someone that they thought, they seem showing some hallmarks of being a Christian, but they were a bit sweary, and I can't remember which one of us was like, "Oh yeah, they're probably not." Like, just as we still have that kind of
absolutely
ingrained in us.
Yeah, I used to have that with violent femmes who are like so ridiculously gospel, but then I was like, oh, but they probably can't be Christians because some of their stuff is like quite sweary or the content is questionable. And I was like, well, talk about yourself, buddy. But then Ben has a theory that, what is your theory? It's kind of like the satanic panic, but in reverse with me.
Yeah, so Jonty just sees Christ in literally absolutely everything, especially in music. Like every musician he comes to, he's like, I think they're a closet Christian.
I think VNV Nation, Depeche Mode, I think these are unquestionable. Covenant, if you're into EBM guys, Covenant, I reckon it's all there. I think it's laid out for us. I actually think Trent Reznor recently came back haunted. Come on, what could that be?
Dear
about?
Lord.
I'm
Trent
serious.
Reznor. Are we serious?
I genuinely think so. He started there anyway. It's fine. Anyway, what do we think? Aside from the different kind of people that Martin Saunders was talking about, that idea of not needing to deconstruct because you focused on Jesus anyway. Does that do it for you, Malky? Why did you not focus enough on Jesus?
Well, but it was because I think it's because of the Bible.
Yeah.
Like, I think I started to and lost my train of thought. But I think the reality of Jesus meeting with people and how Jesus treated people, and also back to the love thing. You don't need to sing this time, but God is love. That's if he is anything. So if in doubt, if there's stuff that seemed to conflict, if I've got ideas in my mind that conflict with an infinitely loving being, what's the most loving, something could be? Well, that can't be God, And like Paul listing the fruit of the Spirit. Come on, Sunday school training, let's kick in. love,
Okay,
joy,
it's
peace.
self-control, dopey, happy, prancer, physical touch, mixtapes, suffering. Yeah,
That's the one.
Yeah.
That was it. I was trying to be sincere, man.
Sorry, dude.
Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. I mean, you can self-control. You can take or leave, to be honest. But
No, I can't.
but the type of person that describes, right? Like they seem pretty rad, you know. So I doubt that person would be into eternal conscious torment, you know.
And yet historically, you know, saints in the church, and you read their stuff, and they just seem like incredibly, you know, amazing people, but they were fully convinced of that. But I, you know, again, not to keep on harping back to Dan McClellan, peace be upon him. But when you hear him talking about the Bible, the Bible itself seems to be a problem for people. I think in Drabs's clip that we heard at the beginning of the show, the Bible itself and a kind of relativizing of the Bible, or realizing that maybe some of the stuff that we believed about the Bible may not be true. You know, what does that do to this sort of stuff? I mean, has that played any part in the deconstruction journey for you guys?
I think I read a book not that long ago, but at the end of last year, I think, called Christ the First 2,000 Years, which basically goes from talking about, you know, how literally goes through the first 2,000 years of Christ, depictions of Christ over the history, which was really, really interesting. And the first time I'd really kind of grappled with how that has changed. And it was the first time that I had really realized that, you know, the Gospels were written by people who wanted to convince other people to become Christians. And that was a really interesting concept for me to kind of like deal with, because I'm like, like, yeah, of course it was. And I think, I don't know, it's an interesting thing to grapple with, of like, yeah, all of this has been put here with the aim of making other people believe this by humans, which is an interesting thing to just like work through. I don't think I'm not like a biblical scholar by any means, so I've lost my train of thought mostly, but that's just like
I think
question.
I think knowing that definitely should give you pause. I guess for me, I also think it's still possible that if a God exists, he could direct some of that.
Sure,
I'm not a Muslim. I don't think he dictates, but I think he probably inspires. But how infallible that inspiration is, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think
reading a
one
book
thing
at the moment, which it's called Women Remembered, but they just made a throwaway comment about so the book generally is about women and their portrayal in the Bible, and they made the throwaway comment that Luke in his gospel were obviously very concerned with trying to take quite like almost academic position on trying to convince people in a more systematic way. And one of the tools he used to do that is to really raise women from the narrative relative to the other gospels. Women just aren't really present in Luke. They don't have much credibility. And that's fascinating as a concept. Like that's a like tool that Luke uses, is to kind of erase women to give it more credibility.
It's one of the reasons that you hear quite a lot about why the resurrection story is true, because it was the women who first discovered the body, and why would they ever include, or who didn't discover the body is actually the main point. So, and why on earth would they include that if you're trying to convince people that this is true, because you wouldn't have believed a woman? But as we know from Dan McClellan, peace be upon him, is that good enough to, is it good enough to prove? I don't know.
I think if you were looking for proof, maybe that was the problem.
Well, yeah, that's true.
Right. I think I always found that really weird when I became a Christian, is people who are like, well, no, checkmate atheists kind of vibes. And I was like, it just seems wildly unlikely that you, Piti Hamadullas in fucking Pretoria have come up with the thing that's going to convince the world intellectually that, you know, the gospel is true. When, yeah, it's just not, that's not a thing. That like 2,000 years of history has not managed it, but, you know, what the greatest minds in Christendom failed to accomplish, you're going to accomplish. Like, I think part of that is part of the problem, and part of what we needed to deconstruct from is that addiction to certainty, that addiction to systems that pretend that even the Bible is univocal and coherent. Because even the resurrection accounts, right? There are two. In one, you know, they go there and there's, is there an earthquake or a loud rumbling or whatever, and the stone rolls away. And the other, they get there and there's just a dude sitting there who's apparently an angel. One of them there's an angel, one of them there's not. It's like the Genesis accounts. There's two conflicting, different accounts placed right next to each other. There's two accounts of Genesis, there's two accounts of the resurrection. It's quite poetic. That in itself gives me a kind of mystical pause to say, well, maybe there's something to be salvaged here, but is that something that we can hold on to in deconstructing?
Well, I remember when I discovered systematic theology and was like,
so do I. Don't we all? We all remember the day.
The crazy days.
I barely knew him.
I remember thinking, why didn't God write the Bible like this? This is much more straightforward and systematized, and we can get our heads around this. But I think the one thing the fundamentalists had right was the slippery slope, in a sense. Like, if you're playing the game around certainty and a tight, coherent system, then once you start questioning some of it, once you start questioning inerrancy, then yeah, it is a slippery slope. So you've got to then find a different anchor or something, compass, I don't know. Because, yeah, as I was speaking to a friend today, who is no longer a Christian, no longer spiritual, like, and she did UCCF stuff with me, and felt like she bought into that. Like, yeah, if it's, you start to pull a thread, then it'll crumble. And it did completely for her. You know, her deconstruction went all the way.
I think that's part of the thing that a lot of people who are anti-deconstruction really fear, is that it's just a path to people not being Christians. And I think you know, in one's more cynical moments, you can notice the people who used to judge you because you weren't a strict enough or certain enough Christian, who are now all deconstructing and, you know, all peace and love. And you're kind of like, where the fuck was this when you were judging the hell out of me? You know what I mean? Like, which is not a charitable or deconstructed or particularly Christ-like attitude. But I think there's something that kind of happens there. I think what's interesting as well is the people who deconstruct and still feel like they want to follow Christ and they want to call themselves Christians as well. And I think it'll be worth hearing from one of them now. Can we hear from Ian?
So I grew up in a definitely evangelical, I guess kind of lightly reformed church tradition. But I was, for a good while, definitely reformed, Calvinistic, and, for example, would have held a 6-day creationist worldview. And engaged in a lot of apologetics. I was the arrogant, argumentative one that would be able to win arguments and think that I was saving everyone for Jesus. And so I guess, like, as I got older, through my 20s into my 30s, then just growing a bit disillusioned with church, with God. And I guess when I was younger, I could more easily accept the black and white worldview of suffering and God's justice and evil and heaven and hell, and that was fine. That gave me a a box to view the world. But it's maybe just growing older. I'm not sure. It's not like I had like one event. It's not like something happened in my life. I didn't have a big faith crisis. It was just kind of slowly picking things away. So I listened to Nomad podcast, and I guess through that was just exposed to so many other new ideas and way of looking at things. And it was hearing some of that stuff, I guess particularly around hell and judgment and whether everybody's saved or not, who gets into heaven and who doesn't, that allowing myself to think some of the things and be more open-minded about stuff, it felt like a sigh of relief. It's like when I engaged with that stuff, then I thought, oh yeah, I want to believe that can be true. And I heard somebody else speaking about deconstruction, and they talked about it like holding all these balloons that was their faith, and they're just kind of like, it was like they were slipping ones and weren't sure how many they could hold on to. But I guess I transformed that a little bit and pictured the house in Up, and me coming to a realization of like, I can hold on to this many and my house still stays up, but like I can let all of these ones go and everything's fine. The world doesn't fall apart, my worldview doesn't fall apart, how I live my life doesn't fall apart. I guess coming to the point of just being okay with not knowing stuff, being okay with mystery and not knowing things, is quite liberating. If you're able to sit with that and able to be there, was quite liberating. And just knowing that like and even now there's some stuff, if I've got a particular balloon and a particular issue about what hell is or what afterlife is, about how easy it is to be saved, about like, I can let that stuff go, and it doesn't change my day to day. It doesn't change how I speak to people that I meet. In fact, it maybe makes me more loving and more accepting, and being able to speak to people easier, that I'm not speaking to people out of this trepidation of I am responsible for their salvation in their life if I don't do this, if I don't carry out my task well enough. So I think through doing that, then it's made me more open, and even like ironically I think more evangelistic, because I could broaden my mission to just being more about people being saved now, and that saving is just about experiencing God and experiencing faith and getting to know Jesus. That makes a difference now, about understanding heaven and hell as realities now, as well as after.
Good, Jim Bob.
What do you think about that?
Bullshit. What a dickhead he is.
I mean, do we want context for the listeners, or do you just want to leave it at that?
Well, who was he getting his Calvinist material from? That's what I want to know.
This guy.
Wasn't me emailing him John Piper sermons.
Oh, Malky.
That is my brother, Ian.
And I think you can tell by the number of pauses.
Oh, thanks.
And by the compassionate heart and the love of the Lord that feels entirely non-toxic.
Yeah. So he actually works for a church up in Shetland, you know. So I reckon he's a proper Christian.
Yeah, which I like. And your pastor claims to be a Christian. Is an actual pastor. And he wrote you something because he believes voice notes are of the devil, or what was why would he not record something for us?
I think the reason actually was to make Malky do a Milton Keynes accent, I believe, which I think if there's no one you can really follow orders from, like, your pastor really should be.
Yeah, you should listen to him. You should submit.
So, yeah, I think you really should.
So let's hear it, Malky, in a Milton Keynes accent.
He says I can do what I want, and it's not really so much a church as just a big gathering of people.
Free association of individuals
who may or may not congregate at the same time Whatever,
whatever,
maybe not.
man.
I think you should
Yeah,
submit
who
to
knows?
your other brothers and sisters in Christ on this podcast and do the accent.
Yeah, we
Alright,
don't say you can do what you like. We
Yeah.
think you should only do this.
We
or you're gonna
dictate what
hell.
you have to do. This is really a salvation issue, actually. Lucky.
All right, governor. That's how it starts. A snake sheds its skin because it's growing. What if I'm meant to shed bits of faith, ways of understanding, models of worship in favour of growth and maturity? What if walking
So a
away
symbol
from...
of the devil, just going to throw it out there.
Don't let that distract
Not
you.
according to Dan
Sorry.
McClellan, interestingly.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, put that out
Yeah,
there.
that's
No, it's just
true.
a serpent. It's not the devil, it's
Yeah,
just a
it's
serpent.
not
Yeah,
associated with Satan in any way, actually.
Actually, check
Just a very
yourself, Gramps.
chatty, just a very chatty serpent. Anywho, what if walking away from former things and walking towards new things is actually the way we grow? What if waking up to the truth that God loves gay people, or isn't a Republican, or doesn't do quiet times, is not so much deconstructing, for which I need to feel alone, scared and unsure, but rather a welcome to actual orthodoxy and a belief that God is... Wait a minute. But rather a welcome to actual orthodoxy and a belief in God as he or she is. And then in 10 years, I'll move on again, grow some more and mature from what I think now, because the universe is expanding and so is God.
Travis, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that was cute. I liked it. I did actually like it, despite my snake thing. One thing that I remember, so when I was going through some of this and my dear wife was not, one of the things she really resented was this idea when I would talk about reaching new stages in faith. And she would be like, you always frame this like you're progressing,
Yeah,
or like
the
you're reaching
progress
higher
narrative
levels.
can be so fucking
And like
patronizing.
I'm being left behind.
Yeah.
And I remember
And in
her
fact,
really
the people
resenting
making
that.
that progress are going to be left behind in the left behind sense of it. They're definitely getting left behind.
Yeah. So I remember just this, and I do sympathize with that. The idea that, and it is a risk of deconstruction. You create this story that you're somehow reaching a higher stage of faith or a higher stage of spirituality or whatever, which I think some of this could be a risk of.
Yeah, because there's an argument that it's just another form of evangelical, repentance and going forward and like, oh yeah, I wasn't good enough, but now I'm even better and I'm leaving everybody else behind. You guys, you can stay there in your old evangelical ways, but I'm going to follow the Lord. As for me and my house, we are going to follow Dan McClellan, Brian McLaren, basically anyone Scottish, Melky, his brother, all of those names, that's who we're following, and we're going to follow them into progress and into higher consciousness. That's I think you can very easily sound like a douchebag on the deconstruction journey, and I think what saves people from doing that is how fucking traumatic it is for people, either in the way that they get into it or just the process of losing community. I'm going to play you two voice notes from people now, first from Tash and then from Annalie, so that you can think about that. You can sit and think about that. Think about what you've done and not done, but also maybe find some experiences that you can relate to. Here is Tash.
I think the deconstruction of my faith moment came for me when a major traumatic life event happened that really turned my world upside down. And I think suddenly I very quickly came to realise that lots of things that I'd put my trust in were not faith-based, that were based on the institution of the church or on false promises that had been made to me by the doctrine of the leadership of the church. And very quickly, when the poo hit the fan, I found that those things fell away and weren't there for me. The confusing part was that the essence of God, the grace, and that and his love was there for me. In fact, that was the only thing that was there for me. And I had to really evaluate the things that I held as important. For example, I think just following certain rules and taking certain things blindly had been my way. And it really challenged me to challenge those things and to dig deeper and actually trust myself. I realised for a long time I'd been conditioned to not trust myself, and it put me in a very unsafe situation. And actually when I needed help and protection, patriarchy and systems like that kicked in, which actually kept certain people safe, but completely removed my protection. And it was a really frightening time. So that started my reconstruction. I have to say that reconstruction is a really long process because you don't realise how ingrained in you those systems are that somehow tell you whether you are good or bad. And so challenging certain things and walking away from them feels like you have to choose one or the other, that you have to completely turn away from God, to perhaps turn away from systems within churches, leadership patterns, rules and regulations. And that was really hard for me for a long time. I lived with guilt for a long, long time. And like I said, I feel if I summed up the whole journey, it's been a journey towards beginning to trust myself. And I think that's still ongoing. But I believe that that's the journey I'm going towards.
I really love that. And I relate to a lot of that stuff. I don't know if we've touched on that really yet, but that kind of emotional, psychological well-being side of things, you know, the kind of big impact of feeling ashamed, basically, feeling unworthy before a God who's judging you, and trying to move to a place of embracing non-judgment and love and acceptance is quite tricky. And obviously, you know, that's all bound up with kind of, you know, all the classic psychotherapy stuff, family of origin and all that business. That resonate with anyone?
I think that's kind of what I was kind of touching on earlier, of like, you would hope that those sort of cause and effect sort of things of somebody go through this traumatic experience to then become, like, enter into a period of deconstruction is hopefully going to happen less. I mean, obviously it's not going to not happen at all, but like, I think as structures of the church change and belief systems within the church change, you would hope that this kind of creates a new era, shall we say. We're in our deconstruction era. But yeah, I think we were going to hear from Annalie as well. So let's hear what she has to say.
Yeah, so I wasn't aware that deconstructing Christianity was a bit of a trend recently. But as I understand it, I suppose I have been in the process of deconstructing my faith over many years. I don't think I had a particularly strong faith to begin with, so I don't know if there was a very strong conviction that I eventually rejected. But I do think throughout various points in my life, I've struggled to reconcile my own beliefs with those of whichever church I've attended. Yeah, I grew up in an NG Kerk and I went to Sunday school and kind of went through all those motions. But my father was not religious and my mom wasn't super religious either. I think she just felt like it was important to be part of a religious community. But it felt dishonest to me to be confirmed into the NG Kerk. So I rejected that when I came of age, and it wasn't a big deal in my family, but it was also considered a bit of a rebellious act. It felt dishonest to me to say that I believed in a bunch of things that I didn't really believe in. And then after that, various close people in my life have been more religious, and I've attended various churches, and I've tried to see what they saw in it, and I've dabbled in various Christian circles, but I think I always had a sense of unease with regards to my faith and struggling with Christian doctrine, struggling with stuff in the Bible, struggling with how a lot of people in my environment interpret the Bible. I think certain intellectual values that are really important to me, being questioning, thinking a bit more critically, being allowed to have doubt, those kinds of things were not very welcome in the kinds of religious environments I found myself. And so I didn't totally see the point of being part of those communities. So while I wouldn't say that I've completely deconstructed my faith, I suppose I've just kind of worked with my doubt through all of these years. A person that I've been drawn to over the last decade, I suppose, has been Richard Rohr. I feel like his ideas really resonate with me. I think he's considered a deconstructionist, if I'm not mistaken, but his kind of ideas are not the type of things that people in my circles typically endorse or want to talk about. So I felt like that's been in more of a private process for me in my own capacity. And that's kind of worked for me. I don't feel a particular desire to belong to a church currently. It makes me angry and frustrated, and I don't see it as particularly helpful for me at this stage. Reading a little bit about what deconstruction is, I think it's kind of encouraging in a way to see that there's a movement towards challenging the church's authority in a way that I haven't seen much of. I think it's pretty healthy. I can imagine that it's controversial and that a lot of churches would be concerned about this sort of thing. But I think having people actually think about their spiritual lives and not just sort of blindly accept whatever it is that they're being told, I think is always a good thing. Yeah, I'm not particularly crazy about the label of deconstruction. I don't think I'd particularly like to be identified as someone who has deconstructed my faith. I don't know if it's an accurate description of what I've done, and I just don't like the label in general. But I suppose for a lot of people who have come from more oppressive settings, maybe being part of a movement with a name could be kind of encouraging or offer some sort of validation or support, and I suppose there's some value in that. Yeah, but I tend to take those kinds of things with a pinch of salt.
So that's Annalie, who is talking about deconstructing almost as a way in which a faith that was never really a thing for her, but that was almost pressured by other people. It was just a way out of that, so she could be kind of honest and kind of live with those doubts, which were a lot stronger than the faith, maybe, I think, which is probably a really valuable thing, but also kind of an indictment on the church in terms of a faith that is kind of socially pressured. You know, is that something that you guys think the deconstruction thing has done for people?
It's changed over the years, because I'm really struck how, like, maybe 15 years ago, when I was exploring a lot of this stuff, I was really having to do it solo. And kids today, do you know what I mean? Hell, my church, which I thought was Con Evo, has set up a little group for the deconstructionists.
Nice. That's postmodernism right there.
So it's like, super moved from like a fringe movement where you felt really alone in it to now it's like, I wouldn't say it's mainstream, but at least you can talk about it in the open environment. Maybe that's a good thing, but I can't help but resent it a little bit because I had to fly solo.
Jonty, will you explain what kind of church setting Annalie would have grown up in? I didn't quite catch what she said, but you're on...
Yeah, she said... Wow, that's racist. NG Kerk, but NG Kerk is the Nederduitse Gereformeerde Kerk, which means Dutch Reformed Church. So it's a strain of Reformed Church. It's Dutch, and I think if you know any Dutch Christians who are part of the Reformed Church. They're quite hardcore. I think the Netherlands had a quite strong Reformation experience, quite an aggressive one, and it's just a quite aggressive strain of Reformed thinking and Calvinism. And the NG Kerk was, I think, most of the prime ministers of apartheid South Africa and presidents of apartheid South Africa, definitely a lot of the architects were dominees or pastors in the Dutch Reformed Church. So it's that kind of Christianity. It's quite severe. It's not the most severe form of Christianity in white South Africa, hilariously. Like, they're considered quite liberal by a group called the Doppers, who are just... And then the Doppers themselves. There's always somebody who's more conservative than you. I think that's the thing that you can find out. Just like you can feel pretty liberal on this podcast, and then, you know, you just have to go to Greenbelt for a bit, and you're like, oh, I'm not that liberal, actually. And I think it goes in the other direction as well. Okay, I think we're pretty much over time for this one. We've got a few more people to hear from, so I think we're going to go into an episode 2. But we'd also like people to get in touch with us on Instagram if you look for Beer Christianity, or on any of the socials, Beer Exianity, Beer Christianity. We're all there, and you can find it on the webpage, beerchristianity.co.uk. Find our socials and send us a voice note or an email, or the emails are beerchristianity@yahoo.com, or you can send us a message on any of the socials. Let us know about your deconstruction journey. I'm particularly interested in finding out what it is you feel you gained from deconstructing, and I think more interestingly, what you feel you lost. I think that'd be really interesting. And we've got a bunch more people that you're going to hear from in part 2. You can hear more from Beer Christianity at beerchristianity.co.uk. And yeah, follow us on all the socials. Also, solidarity and strength to all the people in the UK and the US and beyond who are protesting in solidarity with Gaza, particularly in the US, on university campuses where your fascist state is cracking down on you. You are doing God's work. We support you, and please pray for the people who are putting themselves in harm's way to hold that country to account. We'll be back very shortly with another episode on Beer Christianity. Thanks so much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.